Hello, I'm Wes Allen. The Perkins Center for Preaching Excellence is committed to helping pastors as they strive to become ever more effective and faithful proclaimers of God's good news. We're convinced that one element of that process entails reading good homiletical literature that pushes us into new ways of thinking about why and how we preach. Today, I have with me David B. Ward, who's an associate professor in the Theology and Ministry Department at Indiana Wesleyan University. This past year, Dr. Ward published a must-read book with Abingdon Press entitled Practicing the Preaching Life. Now, in this work, he shifts the homiletical conversation from homiletical techniques that you find in most textbooks to practices that give life to preachers and to their preaching. Dave, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me be here, Wes.
I wonder if you wouldn't mind starting us off by telling us why you are doing this shift, why you're shifting the conversation to practices, and how you see that changing the way we think about preaching.
Sure. One of the things I think is difficult for preaching is many preachers focus on a single Sunday, and you can lose the forest for the trees. So a practice, the idea of a practice helps us understand that it's something we do across time and it's sustained across time. So that's one of the initial reasons. Another reason is I've always said to preachers, if you want to improve your preaching, you have to grow as a whole person, because everything you are comes into the preaching moment, and your listeners have more antennas than they even know they have. So they sense things they don't even know why they're sensing. So if you want to grow, you have to grow the whole person. So then you have to ask, well, if this is a practice, what kind of person do you need to be to do this practice well? How do I need to grow? And so the practice leads you to the virtues that you need then lead you to the Christian practices that sit underneath preaching. They're like the well that you draw from. People speak of it that way sometimes. And then that helps me weave the practice of preaching in together with all of the Christian life and all of the ministry life, so that a pastor doesn't put preaching over on a shelf and then take it off the shelf, put it over on the shelf, take it off the shelf, but weaves it together in a way that's sustainable and beautiful, hopefully good, at least most Sundays.
Well, certainly, I mean, as I read the book, you have a pastoral tone in your approach to preachers, not just the church in general, but to preachers, and I really appreciate that. Can you describe some of the practices that you promote that you would offer preachers to embody and embrace?
Well, sure. I give it in the middle of the book. It's sort of work my way through a practical theology to get to it. But in the middle of the book, I give sort of a translation of the classical practices that the Wesleyan tradition has offered. And I call them practices of compassion, practices of devotion. Those who are familiar will recognize works of piety, works of mercy. I think practices language is better. It's not so works righteousness. And devotion, compassion works better in our culture. But those sets of practices are just basically being Christian. And I try to help preachers understand that when they're doing those things, it's not because they're a pastor, it's because they're a Christian. And they fund preaching if we have worked ahead enough. If the sermon is in our pocket, the whole world is an illustration, as I like to say. So when we go to the hospital, when we go to the nursing home, things open up for us. Now, we don't immediately use those people as illustrations. That would be wrong. But it opens up skylights of our imagination. It forces us into empathy. It gives us wisdom we wouldn't have had. I've had a lot of experiences pastoring where those pastoral care moments really, really helped preaching. So one of the practices that I have preachers do is to start 4 weeks in advance, which is the number one thing that is hard for preachers to do. So I spend a whole chapter on how to schedule your rhythm. So that, and really all I ask them to do 4 weeks in advance is just read the text. It's not too oppressive. I should say that in case the preacher's already saying, I'm done. Just read the text that you're going to preach 4 weeks away. And then the subconscious, and if you believe in the Spirit like I do, the Spirit of God perhaps can begin to work on the soil of your own soul with that passage. And even when you're not working on it, ministry and life starts to feed that soil as well. You read it again the third week out, and then there's a whole structure to start 13 days before. I had a 63-year-old pastor text me the other week. He's planted several churches, great preacher. He texted me and said, Dave, I went through your seminar, I read the book, I've applied it, and he's been doing it for 6 months. He said it's completely transformed my ministry. Wish I had it 40 years ago. And he was already a good preacher. I've heard him preach. He's a good preacher. But the rhythms made life more sustainable. He was getting more rest. His preaching was clearer. He wasn't so anxious. And I was just speaking to his sons just a couple days ago because they are doing an independent study with me. He happened to be studying here. And they were just raving about the change for him. And really, it's just simple practices that you put in place that are good news to the preacher, if I can put it that way.
Yeah.
They open up space.
Well, you know, from my work, I also have a concern for the cumulative effect of preaching. And you rightfully in the book say a lot of homiletics focuses on the sermon, you know, the individual sermon. And your approach to practices expands that out to really focus on preaching as a whole, one's preaching ministry. But I fear that some of our viewers might hear that you're saying by inviting us to embrace practices and virtues, etc., I have to be a perfect Christian to be able to preach well. And in the book, of course, you say that's not what you mean. But I want to give you a chance to just say a word about that here.
Oh, sure, perfectly. Well, I mean, theologically, we call these things means of grace. So what I say to preachers is, you're all going to be imperfect. As soon as you recognize your imperfection, recognize that as a need for grace, then ask yourself, where has God told us that we get that grace? Then just go there. So I talk about practices as a place where you wait, where you abide, where you dwell, not a new thing you do. So it just reorients us. And you don't have to do these things every day. You don't have to do them every week. It's not about legalism or works righteousness. But it like any other discipline, I guess, it never feels good up front. You don't want to do it up front. You have to remind yourself how you'll feel after. So sometimes I challenge preachers to give a whole Saturday morning to TV, whatever junk food they want to eat, watch their favorite movie, binge watch Netflix or whatever, then journal. The next Saturday, go to a prison. And then afterwards journal, and then compare the two journals. And then once they've done that, they get the idea. This isn't about you being perfect. It isn't about you doing everything wonderfully, but it's about the richness of life that following Christ actually gives us, that he really does have a way of abundant life. Go figure. And if we follow him in it, it gives us richness back, but we don't think so up front. Our self-centeredness wants to keep us on the couch, in the chair, in front of the TV.
Yeah, I like to think of your language of preaching as a means of grace. I like to think of that as you do, not only for the congregation, but it's a means of grace for the preacher.
Yes.
And, you know, once you preach enough, you realize that the sermonic moment is not where preachers find their grace. They're serving the congregation. It really is in the discipline, and that word comes with a lot of weight for a good reason, but it's in the discipline of preparing sermons in a whole pastoral life that we find that grace, I think.
That's very true. One of the other practices I have preachers do is to preach their sermons out loud, which isn't new to me. It's not new from me. A lot of preaching professors suggest that. But the way I suggest people do it is in such a way that God can speak to the preacher in the process. So I say it's not just you perfecting your performance. No, consider it an act of worship and a way of tuning into the Lord. And then you'll hear the sermon address you first. And then you'll know when it's a good sermon because it was a good sermon for you. So bringing it out into an oral space is a spiritually formative practice. It's a way God meets us. And in that way, it becomes a privilege and a gift every time we get to preach.
Now, to take us in a little different direction, one of your chapters, you deal with social justice issues, especially you mentioned them in other places, but we live in a day when our country is greatly divided. There's been a strong surge of Black Lives Matter movement since the death of George Floyd. In fact, you talked with us about that in another interview and all. So I want to give you a chance to say a word about how practices helps inform a specific approach to some topical issues in the preaching life. So how do you see practices informing prophetic social justice kind of preaching?
Sure. Well, one of the practices I often talk about is Christian conversation, where you are rooted in communities and you are speaking in a way that is centered around scripture, centered around testimony, centered around confession, those sorts of things. And if we're doing that in diverse settings, and that's my first challenge in this area, is that people need to be intentional about engaging diverse communities, diverse relationships, et cetera, when the pastor is also doing that. it gives us a much richer understanding of what we can say to these social justice issues. I remember, right after some of these, this first wave of the George Floyd thing was happening, I texted 8 different African-American pastors that are dear friends to me, just to check in. And what I received back, just to say, I love you, I care for you, I'm praying for you, how are you doing? What came back from that, I didn't expect it, wasn't looking for it, was this rich diversity of understanding of how differently those 8 different pastors are experiencing life, engaging this moment. And so I'm a white male, you're a white male, we're having an interview. It's good for us to name that, I think, our embodiment. And for what often happens for white male preachers is when they really out of good heart want to preach about social justice, but they don't have an empathy with the diversity of people. Even when they think they do, they're generalizing a whole people group. And so that's one way practices can fund it. When we have those Christian conversations, it gives us greater wisdom, greater empathy, greater understanding of nuance. It helps us draw together disparate people and find things that we can say that don't divide, but unite and still move us forward. And that's probably what's missing most in the secular conversation around this, in my mind. Nobody's doing that. So I think that's one thing preaching can offer to the culture, not just to the church.
Well, Dave, thank you for taking a little time with us and for our viewers. The book, again, is Practicing the Preaching Life. You can find it on all your usual online ways of ordering. It's from Abingdon Press, 2019. We hope you'll tune in for future interviews of authors for must-reads, and keep looking for our What's a Preacher to Do in relation to racism and the pandemic. So thank you all. Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, Wes.